You may recall that in the Getting Started section under Authentication, it referred to setting an authentication state observer to get user data. So we can watch for the authentication state to change one way or the other and get the user data that way, meaning we don't have to explicitly call then after sign in with pop-up happens if we set up this observer. This observer will see it happen without us explicitly saying, well, after sign in with pop-up, do this thing. After sign out, do that thing. We can just say, after the authentication state changes, do something. So let's update it to use that flow instead. So we won't have the handle auth callback here. We'll just call sign in with pop-up. So I don't need this prop listed in sign in. So in app, I don't need to pass that down. We can keep this shorter. But what we do need is this thing, onAuthStateChanged. And that's going to get called on this auth object that we imported. So when should this happen? When should we start listening for the auth state to change? We have component did mount, which is going to run as soon as the thing's rendered to the DOM, but we could start listening even earlier than that. We learned about these lifecycle methods on Friday, and we learned that there's a did and a will for each of these sort of states in the lifecycle. So component did mount runs right after it's added to the DOM. Component will mount would be run right before it's added to the DOM. So nothing will have even rendered to the page. And we can go ahead and start listening for the auth state to change. So let's add another lifecycle method here, component will mount. We expect that to get run right after the constructor. We're already importing this auth thing. So we want to be able to run auth.onAuthStateChanged. Which is going to start waiting for that to happen. And it looks like that receives a function, a callback, that'll receive a user object. And if that user is there, we can do one thing. It means the user signed in. Else, it means they're signed out. So, okay. onAuthStateChanged is going to receive a function. That function will receive a user as its argument. If user signed in, else signed out. So instead of calling auth handler from way down in the sign-in component, we can just call it here. And here it's this.auth handler, right? An auth handler right now is written to receive that result object that had the user as its as a property. But this callback in onAuthStateChanged receives the user directly. So we can rewrite this so that it just receives the user as its argument. So then we just need user.uid. Because now that we're manually calling handle auth up here, we already have this user object available to us. So we can call this.handler, pass in the user. And if we're signed out, we could call this.signout. Or we could do, so that button's still going to have to do something, right? The sign out button's going to have to do something. Calling sign out's reasonable. But here again, we have a then that sets UID back to null. We don't really need the then because we know that onAuthStateChanged is going to run if we sign out. If we call auth.signout, that means that Firebase auth state is going to change. Because this is an actual Firebase method. So whatever we want to do after that finishes is going to run in the else of this function that we passed to onAuthStateChanged. So we could call setState UID null here. Make sense? So onAuthStateChanged, something we attach to that authentication object, and it gets called whenever the user sign-in state changes, when we log in or out. And it receives a method or a function that will receive a user as its argument. If that user is there, that means we signed in. Otherwise, it means we signed out. Anything that makes the auth state change. Does it still work? Does clicking sign in still do the thing? Looks like it. Uh-oh. This.auth handler is not a function. Handle auth. Thank you. Hey, there we are. Sign out. Sign in. And now I pass in the user because we don't get that. We get that result object from sign in with pop-up. Now that we're using onAuthStateChanged, we get a user. So it's just user.id. So here's another nice side effect of using onAuthStateChanged versus using those promises. Refresh the page. I'm still signed in because we never called auth.signout. But if we only called this stuff when we actually click the sign in button, if that's the only way that state ever got updated with that UID, then it wouldn't happen until we clicked the button, even if we were already signed in. But with onAuthStateChanged, it's going to catch that. It's going to know we're already signed in. So we stay signed in even if we refresh the page. So what do they call this in the docs? An authentication state observer. So that's what we changed. We're still doing the same thing. It's just instead of using those promises, we're using an authentication state observer. Set up an authentication state observer. Just wait for the authentication state to change and then call this. Do one thing if we're signed in, another if we're signed out.
Difference between did and will in this situation?
One happens right before something, and the other happens right after that something. And what mount means is this component actually gets rendered to the DOM. Render gets called, in other words. So this will run before render. This will run right after render. But that actually brings up a good point.